street of the small western town. Martha Henley stood beside her weathered wagon, wiping perspiration from her brow as she gazed up at the modest two-story house that would be her new home. At 72, she had never imagined starting over again, but life had a way of surprising even the most prepared souls. The wagon was loaded with everything she owned: a rocking chair that had belonged to her mother, wooden crates filled with dishes and linens, a trunk containing precious photographs and letters, and various pieces of furniture wrapped carefully in old quilts. Each item told a story, carried a memory, and represented a lifetime of collecting moments rather than things. Martha had purchased the house, sight unseen, through a letter exchange with the previous owner. After losing her small farm to drought and debt, she had scraped together enough money to start fresh in Willowbrook, drawn by stories of its kind community and fertile valley. But as she stood there now, watching townspeople hurry past without so much as a glance in her direction, she wondered if those stories had been too optimistic. She approached a young man carrying groceries toward his horse. "Excuse me, sir," she said with a gentle smile. "I wonder if you might spare a few minutes to help an old woman move some boxes." The man barely slowed his pace. "Sorry, ma'am. Got to get these supplies home before supper." He tipped his hat politely, but continued walking, leaving Martha standing alone beside her wagon. Undeterred, Martha tried again with a woman sweeping the porch of the general store. "Good afternoon. I'm Martha Henley, your new neighbor. I don't suppose you'd know anyone who might help me carry some things into my house." The woman paused in her sweeping, looked Martha up and down, then shook her head. "Folks around here are pretty busy this time of day. You might try asking at the saloon, though I wouldn't recommend it for a lady." As the afternoon wore on, Martha approached a dozen different people, with the same polite request, and the same disappointing result. Some were genuinely busy, others simply uninterested in helping a stranger. A few offered sympathetic smiles but no actual assistance. With each rejection, Martha's shoulders sagged a little more, but she refused to let discouragement defeat her entirely. By the time the sun had dipped low enough to paint the sky in shades of orange and pink, Martha had managed to carry only a few of the lighter boxes into the house. Her back ached, her arms trembled from exertion, and she still had the heavy furniture to move. She sat on the front steps of her new home, looking out at the wagon that seemed to mock her with its remaining load. The sound of approaching hoofbeats caused her to look up. An older man on horseback was making his way slowly down the street, his horse moving at an unhurried pace that suggested its rider was in no particular rush. As he drew closer, Martha could see he was probably in his mid-70s, with silver hair that curled slightly beneath his worn hat, and deep lines around his eyes that spoke of a lifetime spent outdoors. The man's clothes were clean, but showed the wear of honest work. Faded denim pants, a cotton shirt with rolled sleeves, and boots that had walked many miles. His horse, a gentle bay mare, seemed as patient and steady as her rider. When he noticed Martha sitting on the steps, he slowed his horse to a stop. "Evening, ma'am," he said, touching the brim of his hat. "Name's Thomas Garrett. I couldn't help but notice you've got quite a load there in your wagon." Martha stood up, smoothing her skirts, and trying to appear more composed than she felt. "Good evening, Mr. Garrett. I'm Martha Henley. Yes, I'm afraid I'm having a bit of difficulty getting everything moved in. I've been asking around town, but everyone seems to be quite busy." Thomas dismounted with the careful movements of a man who had been riding horses for decades, but whose bones reminded him daily of his age. He walked over to the wagon and peered inside, assessing the remaining items with an experienced eye. "This rocking chair's a beauty," he commented, running his hand along its smooth armrest. "Handmade, I'd guess." "Probably worth more than money to you. It was my mother's," Martha replied, surprised by the man's perceptiveness. "And yes, it means the world to me." "Well then, we'd better make sure it gets inside safely." Thomas began rolling up his sleeves. "Can't have you trying to muscle this heavy furniture around by yourself. That's a sure way to get hurt." Martha felt a rush of gratitude so strong, it brought tears to her eyes. "Mr. Garrett, that's incredibly kind of you, but I couldn't ask you to spend your evening helping a complete stranger." "You didn't ask," Thomas said with a smile that transformed his weathered face. "I'm offering. Besides, My evening was just going to consist of sitting on my porch, wondering why my ranch feels too quiet these days. This gives me something useful to do. Working together, they developed an efficient system. Thomas would carefully lift each piece from the wagon, while Martha guided him through the house, deciding where each item should go. Despite his age, he proved surprisingly strong, handling even the heaviest pieces with care and confidence. As they worked, they talked. Martha learned that Thomas had been ranching in the area for over 50 years, that he had built his spread from nothing, and that he had recently lost his wife of 45 years to illness. Thomas discovered that Martha had been a schoolteacher before marrying her husband, that she had raised 3 children, who were now scattered across the country with families of their own, and that she had spent the last 5 years caring for her ailing husband before his death. Teaching must have been rewarding, Thomas said as they maneuvered the rocking chair through the front door. It was, Martha agreed. There's something wonderful about watching a child's face light up when they finally understand something that's been puzzling them. I think I learned as much from my students as they did from me. I bet they still remember you, Thomas said. Good teachers leave a lasting mark. When they reached the living room, Martha indicated where she wanted the rocking chair placed. As Thomas set it down gently, Martha ran her hand along its familiar curve. Mother used to sit in this chair every evening, she said softly. She'd rock and knit or read to me from her book of poetry. Even after I was grown and married, whenever I visited, she'd still be in this chair. Sounds like she was a special lady, Thomas said gently. She was. She used to say that home isn't a place, it's where love lives. I'm hoping to find that feeling again in this house. They continued working as the sky darkened, and the first stars appeared. Thomas insisted on lighting the oil lamps so they could see properly, and Martha found herself marveling at his thoroughness and consideration. He moved with the methodical precision of someone accustomed to hard work, but also with a round gentleness that suggested he understood the emotional value of the items they were moving. When they carried in a wooden trunk, Thomas noticed how carefully Martha handled it. Family photographs? He guessed. Among other things, Martha said. Letters from my children, some from my late husband during the early years of our marriage, my teaching certificates, a few books that mean a great deal to me. The real treasures, Thomas said, understanding immediately. As they worked on moving the last few pieces, Martha found herself studying Thomas's face in the lamplight. Something about him seemed familiar, though she couldn't place what it was. Perhaps it was simply the kindness in his eyes, or the way he moved with quiet confidence, or the gentle way he spoke. Mr. Garrett, she said as they set down a small dresser. Have we met before? You seem familiar to me somehow. Thomas paused, a strange expression crossing his face. What was your maiden name, if you don't mind me asking? Porter, Martha replied. Martha Porter. I grew up about 100 miles east of here, in a little town called Cedar Falls. Thomas went very still. In the lamplight, Martha could see a range of emotions playing across his features. Surprise, recognition, and something that looked almost like wonder. Martha Porter, he repeated softly. Sweet Martha Porter, with the golden braids and the smile that could light up a room. Now it was Martha's turn to go still. How do you know about my braids? I haven't worn my hair that way since I was young. Because, Thomas said, his voice barely above a whisper. I'm Tommy Garrett. I sat behind you in Miss Williams's classroom for 2 whole years, completely tongue-tied every time you looked at me. The words hit Martha like a physical force. She sank into the rocking chair, her hand pressed to her chest. Tommy? Little Tommy Garrett, with the freckles and the gap between his front teeth? The very same, Thomas said, though his smile was tentative, uncertain of her reaction. Though the freckles have faded, and the gap got fixed years ago. Oh my goodness, Martha breathed. Tommy Garrett, I had the most terrible crush on you. You did? Thomas's eyes widened. But you never said anything. I was far too shy, and you seemed so focused on your studies, and helping your father with the ranch. I thought you barely knew I existed. Barely knew you existed? Thomas laughed, a sound filled with amazement and old affection. Martha, I spent 2 years trying to work up the courage to ask if I could walk you home from school. I wrote your name in my notebook margins, and practiced conversations with you while I was doing chores. They sat in silence for a moment, both overwhelmed by the strangeness and beauty of this reunion. The years seemed to fall away as they looked at each other, seeing traces of the children they had been in, the faces they wore now. "What happened to you?" Martha asked finally. "One day you were in school, and the next day you were just gone." Thomas's expression grew sad. "My father got hurt in a riding accident. Badly hurt. We had to leave Cedar Falls so he could be near the doctor in the big city. I wanted to say goodbye to you, wanted to write to you, but we left in such a hurry, and then time just went on." "I looked for you," Martha admitted. "I asked Miss Williams, but she said your family had moved away, and she didn't know where. I thought about you for years," Thomas said softly. "Wondered what became of you, whether you were happy, whether you'd gotten married and had children. When I finally came back to this area and started my ranch, I thought about trying to find you, but I figured you'd probably forgotten all about the awkward boy who sat behind you in school." "Forgotten?" Martha's voice was filled with gentle disbelief. "Tommy, you were my first love. You don't forget your first love." The words hung in the air between them, honest and vulnerable and beautiful in their simplicity. Thomas reached out and gently took Martha's hand, and she didn't pull away. "Life's strange, isn't it?" he said. "All these years, all the paths we've taken, all the people we've loved and lost, and somehow we end up here, in this moment, in this room." "Mother always said everything happens for a reason," Martha said, thinking of the rocking chair and the woman who had loved her so well. "I didn't know what she meant then, but maybe I'm beginning to understand." They talked through the night, sharing the stories of their lives, the joys and sorrows, the dreams fulfilled, and the ones that had to be let go. Thomas told her about building his ranch, about the wife he had loved dearly and lost too soon, about the children who had died in infancy, and the loneliness that had settled over his life like dust on unused furniture. Martha spoke of her years of teaching, of her marriage to a good man who had loved her steadily, if not passionately, of the children she had raised, and the grandchildren she saw too seldom, of the farm that had failed, and the decision to start over in a new place. As dawn began to creep through the windows, they realized they had spent the entire night talking, neither wanting to break the spell of rediscovery. The house around them was now properly furnished, every item in its place, looking like a home instead of just a building. "I should probably head back to my ranch," Thomas said reluctantly. "But I wonder, would you allow me to take you to dinner tomorrow evening? There's a nice little restaurant here in town, and I'd very much like to continue our conversation." "I'd like that very much," Martha said, her smile radiant in the morning light. As Thomas prepared to leave, he paused at the door. "Martha, I want you to know that helping you move in was the best evening I've had in years. Not because of the coincidence of who you turned out to be, but because of who you are now. You're still that sweet girl with the beautiful smile, but you're so much more. You're a woman who's lived a full life and learned how to love well. And you," Martha said, "are still that kind boy who always helped others. But now you're a man who's learned how to see what truly matters." After Thomas left, Martha sat in her mother's rocking chair and looked around her new home. Every piece of furniture, every photograph, every book was exactly where it needed to be. But more than that, the house felt like what her mother had always said home should be, a place where love lives. She didn't know what the future would bring, didn't know if the gentle affection she felt for Tommy Garrett would grow into something deeper, didn't know if two people in the autumn of their lives could write a new love story. But she knew that sometimes the most beautiful gifts come disguised as ordinary moments, and sometimes the help we think we need is actually the help we've been waiting for our whole lives. Outside her window, the town of Willowbrook was beginning to wake up. But inside her home, Martha Henley sat in her mother's rocking chair and smiled, finally understanding what it meant to come home.